Hello, and welcome to the Historical Geography of U.S. Presidential Elections. Today's lecture is on elections under the first party system, 1788 to 1820. The first party system is often taken to have lasted until 1824, but I'm just going to go up to 1820. Before getting into the information on presidential elections, I want to give a little bit of background material. I'll start with a map showing the United States at the time of its founding. It's kind of hard to distinguish the 13 original colonies on this map. It is important to note under the British colonial regime, each colony had quite a bit of autonomy from other colonies. The United States was by no means united well before it became a country. A few other things to note on here. The original 13 colonies included 16 current states. So just to outline those, Massachusetts included Maine as a separate territory until Maine became a state in 1820. Vermont was not one of the original colonies. It's usually appended to New York, although there was something of a Vermont Republic during the Revolutionary period. And West Virginia was part of Virginia. It didn't become a state until the Civil War. The counties of the northwestern part of Virginia did not secede, and so the state was separated. I also want to emphasize the very large Northwestern Territory that was ceded to the United States by the United Kingdom. But at the time, when the United States became a country, there were still active British forts within this area, and it would become a bone of contention in the War of 1812. Slavery was banned in this Northwestern Territory by the Northwestern Ordinance of 1787. That was before the United States became a country. It was before the ratification of the Constitution. But it was a very important act that was really to have significant consequences for the settlement of the Western United States and for the what was to become the all-important slavery question. Note that under the first party system, I have a Wikipedia map here, which is a very interesting map because it just shows overall voting patterns throughout that entire first party system. So the orange or the reddish shaded states here, red to yellow, are states that generally tended to vote for the Federalist Party, and green for the opposing Democratic Republican Party, which I'll outline a little bit later. But before we get into that, I want to note that the first party system was characterized by fairly poorly organized parties. Well, first, they weren't parties at all. They developed in the early years of the Republic, but they didn't have the kind of organization that later parties would have. As I've mentioned in previous lectures, there was quite limited democracy at this period. There was certainly a lot of democracy insofar as states and more local areas were concerned, but as far as the federal government goes, only a few states, well, an increasing number of states had direct elections for the electors who would pick the presidents. And so we'll look at that later on. As marked by what's often called a culture of deference, sort of class deference. The founders of the Republic were men, entirely men of a relatively high class background, and there was quite a bit of sort of traditional deference shown to them. The presidency during this whole period was dominated by founders, and it was before the period of real presidential campaigns. Presidential campaigns in the modern sense don't really begin till the 1830s. We'll see later, 1840 was a crucial election. And so, as mentioned before, this is a period when there was the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans eventually come to be these first two parties, and both of them will disappear. The Federalists will collapse, and the Democratic Republicans will split and morph into separate parties at the end of this first party system. So the overall theme of this lecture is the triumph of the Democratic Republican Party. That's the Jeffersonian Madisonian Party, followed by its almost immediately followed by its fracturing or breaking up after it defeats the Federalists and has a period of triumph. I also want to emphasize that the first party system, this was a relatively stable period in presidential history. There were some pretty nasty presidential elections. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But by stable, I just mean that most presidents during this period served for full 2 terms. What I've done here is I have a photograph and the years in office of every president of the United States. And I put a heavy red box around every president who served 2, or in the case of Franklin Roosevelt, more than 2, full consecutive terms. Grover Cleveland served 2 full terms, but that was interrupted by the presidency of Benjamin Harrison, so he doesn't count. This is in the late 1800s. Then in a fuzzy green line, I have presidents who were not elected to office. These were people who stepped into office after the president died, vice presidents. So we can see a number of them in the second party system, but some sort of throughout. And then presidents who were elected to the office but served less than 1 term. They died in office, essentially. And you can see quite a few of those in the second party system. So as far as periods when you had a number of presidents who were elected to 2 full consecutive terms, you could see a lot in this first party system from Washington, not Adams, but then Jefferson and Madison and Monroe, not John Quincy Adams, and then moving on to the second party system, we have Andrew Jackson. The only other period in American history where this is common is the sort of the recent period where we had Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and then Barack Obama, but it has not been the norm. Another slide I want to spend a little bit of time on is the map to the left, showing ethnic diversity in the early years of the Republic. In the case of the map on the left before the Republic was established. I'll focus on the one on the left. The one on the right is important, but it's a little harder to read. So interested people can look at that at their own on their own time. But the important point to note in that 1757 map on the left is that, yes, there was considerable ethnic diversity. Now, this is obviously not including indigenous inhabitants. It's only European settlers or enslaved Africans. And it's showing purporting to show anyway, majority population in different areas. So you can see in New England here with basically, at the time, coastal areas of what is now Maine and far southern New Hampshire, most of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Very clearly English, or as the map says, English and Welsh predominance as far as ethnic identity goes. It's also important to note the religion, that this is an area where most people were not members of the Church of England or the Anglican Church. Most of them were dissenters, often called Puritans at the time. This would become the Congregationalists. We also had Baptists and other groups. Whereas the English settlements further south in Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, North Carolina, and to South Carolina, the dominant religious background at this time was the Anglican Church, or what would become called the Episcopalian Church in the United States. Although it is important to note in the United States, well, and too in England too, there were certainly quite a few dissenters, but there was a distinct religious difference between North and South, and a much higher level of religiosity, religious fervor or belief in the North at that time, in the New England colonies. Note in New York, in the Hudson River Valley, eastern part of New York, we have an area here marked as Dutch. It was very mixed, of course, but this had been a Dutch colony up until the, it was only a few decades, but there was definitely quite a bit of Dutch settlement along the Hudson River. A lot of large estates were established, and the Dutch language continued to be spoken. President Martin van Buren, who followed Andrew Jackson, spoke Dutch as his first language and grew up in that area. And it's a politically distinctive place. It's important to note Pennsylvania was at this time the most ethnically diverse state as far as European people of European background. So in the Far East, plenty of people of English descent, but notice a large German area. William Penn, the proprietor of this colony, a Quaker, was very open to immigration from different parts of Europe. And Germans moved into other areas. You can see some in New York, you can see some in North Carolina, but the largest group was this sort of southeastern part of Pennsylvania. And then on the far western side of Pennsylvania, we'll see Scots-Irish, and you can see a lot of those in that light green in the Carolinas as well. I'll talk quite a bit more about the Scots-Irish in a couple lectures from now. But by Scots-Irish, we mean people who are of Protestant religious background, who were from Northern Ireland, Ulster. Originally had been from Scotland, moved to Ulster in Northern Ireland, and then large numbers moved into the United States and became very important, particularly as frontier settlers. Very important in Pennsylvania, further south in the Appalachian region, and had a very distinctive culture and distinctive political culture that we will talk about at some length. Then the map shows areas where the majority population is enslaved, noted as African here on the map. You can see eastern part of Virginia, large plantation zone. Certainly throughout the South, there were large numbers of black people, but only in a few areas were they a majority. The most important of those areas would be coastal South Carolina and extending down into coastal Georgia. South Carolina was black majority all the way through the pre-Civil War period and even beyond that. South Carolina had a very distinctive, highly hierarchical, and not particularly democratic culture in the period of the early Republic. And one of the reasons for that was no doubt the very large enslaved population. And then finally, in a bluish color here, we have Scottish. And you could see Scottish areas, particularly in the South. The most important of these would be in sort of southeastern, not on the coast, but inland, southern North Carolina. There was a substantial settlement, and these were Scottish Highlanders. These were, in this case, these were people who had rebelled against the United Kingdom in the early 1700s. Again, in the mid 1700s, large numbers of them were. Most of them were basically lost their land. The clans of the Scottish Highlands were broken up. The small farmers or crofters were dispossessed. Large numbers of them came to the colonies. We will see later on that this area, though, in inland southern North Carolina, settled by Scottish Highlanders, became a zone that was very loyal to Britain, to the United Kingdom during the Revolutionary War, and subsequently very loyal to the Federalist Party. And that might seem anti-intuitive. The Scottish Highlanders had been crushed by the armies of the United Kingdom, basically sent across the ocean, but yet remained loyal to Britain. That may seem quite surprising. But one of the factors behind this was they were given large grants of land. And so these were people who had come from these tiny little farms of very poor soil in the Scottish Highlands and were given grants of land, and that tended to lead to loyalty to the United Kingdom and then hence to the Federalist Party. As far as slavery goes, I will be talking a lot about the distinction between the free states of the North and the slave states of the South, which was particularly important in the Second Party period from especially 1830s through the 1850s and then culminating in the Civil War. But point I want to make here is it wasn't quite so clear-cut at the time. Now, in the old Northwest or Northwestern Territories, slavery banned by law, by that Northwestern Ordinance, yes. But I've used a little different terminology here. I've taken the Mason-Dixon line that separates Pennsylvania from Maryland, usually known as the division between the free and the slave states. But rather than label the states to the north the free states, I labeled them the freeing states because slavery still existed in the early republic in the north. Massachusetts and New Hampshire got rid of slavery about the time the United States was founded, but the other northern states had a gradual policy of people born into slavery were not to continue being slaves in most cases, but they didn't eliminate slavery overnight. And I'll draw your attention particularly to New Jersey, which was the least free of the free states. I have a quotation here. You could read that on your own. But it notes that in 1846, New Jersey passed a law that technically ended slavery by reclassifying enslaved people as apprentices for life. Slaves, in other words. And there were still quite a few enslaved people in New Jersey at the time that the 13th Amendment abolished slavery after the Civil War. One other thing to note about slavery, when I looked into the fact that the Northwest Ordinance banned slavery from the Northwestern Territories, I was a little surprised that there wasn't more Southern opposition to that. And when I made inquiries into that, I kept getting information about how, well, that supposedly slavery was not economically viable in these areas. And that is not strictly true. One way we can look at this is look at a map from 1850 showing the enslaved population at the time. Map's not entirely accurate. It's not showing any enslaved people in New Jersey and New York, and there were still some there. But I've put circle and an oval around two areas with pretty substantial enslaved populations. One would be the bluegrass region of Kentucky, and the other would be central Missouri, sometimes called Little Dixie, along the Missouri River. And both those are, in terms of climate and soil, pretty much the same as southern Illinois, southern Indiana, southern Ohio. Same crops are grown there. And slavery was certainly economically successful in Kentucky and Missouri all the way up till the Civil War. In the bluegrass region of Kentucky, tobacco was an important crop. Hemp was an important crop, and both very labor demanding. Hemp, particularly for extracting the fibers from the stalks, very labor intensive. And slavery made more sense, economically speaking, in areas where you had agricultural crops that had high labor demand, and labor demand through much of the year. Certainly true of cotton, to a large extent true in tobacco. But if you go into areas that were dominated by wheat farms, and that wheat belt moved in different places, but it was definitely in the northern part of the United States. It was a time when northern Illinois was one of the main wheat producing areas. There was a time when upstate New York was one of the main wheat producing areas. But wheat has a huge labor demand at harvest time, and to a lesser extent at planting time. But through much of the year, there's very little labor demand. And so many economic historians have noted that it didn't make sense to grow wheat with an enslaved labor force, because there wouldn't have been the labor demand for them during most of the year. One thing that's interesting, the wheat belt led to, or at least was associated with the growth of a lot of small cities, because cities, even small cities, could supply a pretty substantial seasonal labor force when went during harvest and threshing period, when before mechanization, when a lot of labor was needed, could come out of these smaller towns and cities, and then in the rest of the year, the economies offered opportunity for work. So just a little side note. Let's finally get into our elections. First election, 1788. It didn't all take place during that year, extended into the next year. There was no party, there was no competition either in this election or the next. It was the founders of the country pretty much agreed that George Washington was the person to lead the country. He was a very, very effective military leader, had great respect from almost everybody. Washington was not too keen on the role. We talked before about the view of Washington as an American Cincinnatus from ancient Rome, somebody who was certainly willing to do his duty by his country, but it wasn't anything he sought out. And that was considered a very good thing. Throughout this first party period, it was considered unseemly for somebody really to seek out the presidency. The presidency was supposed to seek out the man. The man wasn't supposed to seek out the presidency. Sort of part of the culture of the time. The map shows a couple areas that might be surprising. Rhode Island and North Carolina in gray. Well, they hadn't ratified the Constitution yet. And New York is as none because its legislature failed to select the electors in time. So there were a lot of difficulties in getting this project off the ground. So there's no competition for the presidency. Washington got he needed 69 electoral votes, and he got 69. Now, in this early period, until the 12th Amendment of the Constitution, you had a situation where each elector had 2 votes, and the candidate who got the highest number would become president, and the second highest would become vice president. So it could lead to rivals, and it did in the next election, or would eventually, but not in this one. It would in 1796. But in this case, Washington and the second highest vote getter, John Adams, were pretty much on the same side of most issues, and they worked together, and so it wasn't really a problem. But already by the second U.S. presidential election, 1792, starting to become a little more contentious. Washington is still almost universally desired to become president. He didn't want to run. He wanted to go back to Mount Vernon, but again, he did what most people thought he needed to do. He needed to have that calm, steady hand to keep the country together in its formative period. Here we get a more of a heated vice presidential contest, and John Adams gets the highest amount, but you could see George Clinton, somebody who is he's from New York, more on the Jeffersonian wing of the party, gets 50. So it's becoming more contentious. And you can see on the map that Kentucky had entered the Union. Tennessee is going to follow soon afterwards. In this same year, 1792, we could see parties emerging. They don't yet have names yet, but this map from Wikipedia shows pro-administration and anti-administration. So pro-administration are those parties, electors in this case, in the Electoral College, who are favorably disposed to the administration of George Washington. In particular, what they're favorably disposed towards is the Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, who is, we'll see that in the next slide. He's starting to create a party, the Federalist Party. So this election anyway, in the House was an anti-administration victory, pretty narrow, but you can see there's a big change in representation in the House. You can see the seat change in the upper left there, with the anti-administration group gaining 24. Now the pro-administration group is gaining as well because the country is expanding and the House of Representatives is expanding. And as the slide notes, the pro-administration faction is becoming the Federalist Party, and the anti-administration faction becoming the Democratic Republicans, or we could say Jeffersonians or Madisonians, if you will. So there's more contention. Parties are emerging in this election. The anti-administration side won in the House. The pro-administration side won in the Senate. So anyway, as I said, parties are being founded, and the Federalist Party is one of the big two. It's essentially founded by Alexander Hamilton. John Adams is certainly considered a Federalist, but he was not particularly interested in the nitty-gritty of politics, of building up a party. As I said in the previous lecture, all the founders were suspicious of parties, if not hostile towards them, factions as they called them. But they're starting to realize that parties of some sort are necessary, and so Alexander Hamilton, usually considered the founder of the Federalist Party. So George Washington was above parties, but he was very close to Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was one of his main aides in the Revolutionary War, and Hamilton had quite a bit of influence over him. Anyway, the Federalist Party wanted more centralization. They didn't want a unitary state by any means, but they wanted relative centralization. They were interested in economic modernization, industries starting to develop in favor of urbanization, what we might call financial capitalism, big banks and the like. They were a little, suspicious of direct democracy, certainly, and they wanted a limited franchise, votes for free men who had property and paid taxes. They wanted a national debt and the means to pay it off. This is something that Britain had developed over the preceding century with a national debt, which had the advantage of having government bonds then that could be traded, and development of a bond market. And this was seen by people like Hamilton as a very effective financial means for a country to develop the means of paying for activities that it needed to do, especially during emergency periods, and a way to create this debt market that would create a vibrant financial sector. Hamilton definitely favored Britain over France. I'll talk about that rivalry in a few minutes. And I dreamed about the United States becoming a great power. One thing really important was his report on manufactures. Now, the Industrial Revolution is just getting going at this period. Late 1700s in northern England, southern Scotland, you start to get the mechanization of the spinning of cotton. And later, cotton weaving is going to start to be mechanized. In the early 1800s, you start getting steam engines. Well, steam engines had already developed, but weren't going to become very useful until a bit later on. So the Industrial Revolution first was definitely the cotton spinning sector of the economy, but spinning cotton was very laborious, and by mechanizing that, you were able to greatly increase productivity in the all-important textile sector. So Hamilton was very keen on this. Well, it's not just textiles, though. He wanted to develop all sorts of making of things, manufacturing in the broader sense of the term. To encourage that, he wanted protective tariffs. Britain was the technological leader in most aspects of all aspects really of the early Industrial Revolution. Hamilton wanted the U.S. to be able to catch up with that, and tariffs to make it more expensive to sell British goods were considered very helpful. And also they would give revenue to the government to do things like, the industrial subsidies that Hamilton wanted. He wanted the federal government to be involved with infrastructure, digging canals, making roads, improving harbors, especially on this transportation infrastructure. And Hamilton wanted a national bank to focus on productive investments and to make the U.S. an industrial power. Hamilton's system would be adopted by the Federalists, later by the Whigs, later by the Republicans. It's sometimes called the American system, which means sort of a guided economic policy that the Federalists, the Whigs, and the pre-Cold War Republicans were in favor of. After the end of the Cold War, when the United States became industrially dominant, the Republican Party switched from a pro-tariff to an anti-tariff stance. But all the way through certainly through the 1920s, Republicans in the U.S. Congress were very much in favor of having large tariffs to protect American industry. And they pretty much disappeared during the international period of the post-Cold War era. Democrats and Republicans alike joined in together to reduce, and in many cases, eliminate tariffs altogether. It's very much back in the news today. If those who follow politics will know that Donald Trump is very much in favor of tariffs. The Joe Biden administration has actually adopted a number of tariffs as well, particularly in terms of in regard to China. I put a little illustration here is from a very interesting American intellectual figure, Michael Lind, who I would, I guess I'd classify him as a centrist populist. I find him interested. I certainly don't agree with him on all issues by any means, but he is somebody who has a sort of a very distinctive voice. And he very much wants a sort of a return to the American system of greater protection, more industry in the United States, suspicious of globalization. And the illustration I have here is Michael Lind saying, what would Hamilton do? And I note this as kind of ironic because Alexander Hamilton at the time represented early America's urban metropolitan elite. And Michael Lind has written a book called The New Class War, Saving Democracy from the Metropolitan Elite. So I put that in just because I find it interesting how ideas from the early period of the Republic still have currency, but in many cases the sort of political valence, if you will, has changed or shifted to a large extent. Anyway, Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Party is very interested in building up what is sometimes called the American civil religion. So it's not a religion per se, but it's a set of sort of deeply ensconced political beliefs about what is right and proper, how the United States is a distinctive country, American exceptionalism, if you will, but tied in with certain not just ideas, but ceremonies or celebrations, 4th of July being the crucial among them. So the Federalists really started pushing 4th of July celebrations. Their opponents, the Jeffersonians, found that they had to emulate this. And in the early Republic, they were often competing 4th of July celebrations. You know, who's the more patriotic group? The illustration here is from 1819, which was a period known as the era of good feelings when the Federalist Party had collapsed and everybody essentially had joined in with the Jeffersonians or Democratic Republicans, a party that would break up almost immediately. Anyway, well, let's get to this Democratic Republican Party. Founded by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They would be the two crucial founders. There were plenty of others. Wikipedia notes them as the founders. I have here the party was interested in what is sometimes called Jeffersonian democracy, so it was much more democratic than the Federalists. They wanted a larger franchise. It's still going to be free white men, but the Federalists wanted stricter property or tax-paying qualifications. Originally, every place had these qualifications, but under the influence of Jeffersonian democracy, and especially under Jacksonian democracy coming in later, these qualifications start to be eliminated, and by the time you're in the 1840s, and pretty much everywhere, free white men have a full franchise. The Democratic Republican Party at this period extolled sort of agrarianism, if you will. They were not, they were more suspicious of cities, suspicious of budding industries, not necessarily opposed to them, but that wasn't what they favored. Their ideal was the yeoman farmer, the smallholder, somewhat self-sufficient, very proud of the freedom that they had. That's a little bit of an irony because Jefferson and Madison both came out of the sort of planter elite group. People had a lot of enslaved people. They were owned. There were a lot of misgivings by people, well, by Jefferson and Madison particularly. They didn't particularly believe that slavery was a good system, and they looked forward to it slowly disappearing, but it was also the bedrock of the economic order under which they lived, and getting rid of it was not something that was immediately getting rid of it was not something that was anyway much contemplated, but certainly they had this ideal of the yeoman farmer. I often hesitate to use the word liberalism because it means different things in different contexts at different times, but the Jeffersonian or Democratic Republican Party in most senses would have been the more liberal. They wanted greater freedoms from the government, for example, and really foregrounded that. They wanted a weaker federal government than did the Federalists. They wanted more sort of semi-sovereignty for the states. They agreed that ultimately the federal government should be the seat of sovereignty, but each state should have a tremendous amount of autonomy. They tended to be anti-clerical. By that I mean a bit suspicious of organized religion. Many of them, Jefferson, for example, was a deist, meaning he thought there was a creator God, but certainly was by no means an Orthodox Christian, and didn't believe in active miracles or anything like this. At this time, the North was much more religious than the South, and also certain appeals to Protestantism. Democratic Republican is our name, not theirs. They called themselves usually Republican, from what I've read, or Democratic, or Jeffersonian, or Madisonian, or other terms that were used, whereas the Federalists did use that term. Back to our actual elections. 1796, the third election, the first one that's contested. So Washington has stepped down. People wanted him to continue, but he was ready to go back to his estate. And so it's John Adams had been vice president, and then Thomas Jefferson, one of the principal founders of the country, is elected as vice president. So what does that mean? That means, well, you can see Adams got 71 electoral votes. That was the most. Jefferson got 68. That was the second most. The problem was they didn't see eye to eye at all. They were increasingly separated by their ideas about foreign policy, about degrees of federal centralization, and so on. If you can see the map here, you can see very clear geographical pattern. Adams was victorious across New England, took all their electoral votes. Also, in this case, New York, though, becomes the sort of the crucial swing state for many years. It would be for decades. Well, one of the swing states. The Federalists had a lot of support in the further south, particularly Maryland and Delaware, very strong Federalist states at this time. Whereas most of the rest of the South, and in this case Pennsylvania, more in the Jeffersonian camp. So the northern areas that the Federalists did well in tended to be more urban. That's even true when we get down a little further south into the mid-Atlantic states. It tends to be the port cities. Tends to be people more involved in a commercial economy, where people who are involved in plantation economies or more self-sufficient economies in sort of the frontier areas tended to favor the Jeffersonians or Democratic Republicans. Anyway, 4 years later, we have Jefferson and Adams back up to contending against each other as well. This slide is slightly out of order, but I wanted to bring it up just to show you how we're starting to develop with the party system a more vituperative form of electioneering, if you will. And I should say the candidates themselves were doing no electioneering. That was totally unseemly at the time. It was to be done by their supporters. But Federalists were already accusing Jefferson of being a Jacobin. That would be a supporter of the French Revolution. And yeah, he was in the early days definitely a supporter of the French Revolution. But as the French Revolution devolved into terror and dictatorship, he had quite a change of mind. But the Federalists accused Jefferson of being a Jacobin, an atheist. Well, he wasn't an atheist, but he certainly was not a Trinitarian Christian. He was a deist. They accuse him of being a drunkard. I don't think there's any evidence. They also accuse him of having had a sexual affair with a slave, Sally Hemings. And we know that's true. We know that from genetic information that's been recovered. But at the time, that was considered quite scandalous. The Democratic Republicans accused Adams of wanting to be a king, even have claimed that he wanted to marry one of his sons to a daughter of George III, and establish a dynasty. The Republicans are beginning to stump at the local level to try to, engaged in campaigning. And the Federalists at first refused to dirty their hands in that, and one of the reasons why they began to decline. But they quickly learned they had to do that. In the House election of 1796, this is when John Adams was elected. The map's a little more detailed because we can see actually House districts here, so we can get a finer grained information about who's supporting whom. You can't really tell cities and towns on this, but you can do it a certain degree, because if you look at the inset map showing New York and Philadelphia, two largest cities in the country at that time by a good margin. And whereas in general that area around them was Federalist voting, both New York and Philadelphia were Republican voting as far as the House of Representatives in this election. And one of the reasons is because of fairly substantial Irish immigration, which is happening from from very early periods, and a lot of Irish immigrants are going into the cities and towns. Not all of them by any means, but many. So you're starting, and even this early period, pretty substantial Irish populations. The Irish tend to be very anti-British. Ireland was under the thumb of the United Kingdom at the time, and that was not at all appreciated certainly by Catholic Irish who immigrated. The Scots Irish, that's a different matter altogether. But actually, both groups tended to support the Democratic Republican Party, the Jeffersonians, the Madisonians, if you will. New England Congregationalists, the descendants of the Puritans, still tend to very much favor the Federalists, as do Catholics in Maryland. Maryland was established as a colony, and for one of the reasons for that establishment was to give a place for Catholics to migrate to. English Catholics were very much discriminated against. There were all sorts of legal and political disabilities against them at this time. And in Maryland was sort of open to Catholic immigration. Most people in Maryland were not Catholic, and we'll see later on there were some counties in which the Catholic areas are concentrated, and they really stand out as pink on this map, supporting the Federalists rather than the Democratic Republicans. The South is mostly Democratic Republican or Jeffersonian, if you will, but there are definitely areas where there were a lot of Federalist support. That's particularly in the richest plantation zones. We can see some of them in eastern Virginia, even more so in South Carolina. We can also see the Scottish Highlander settlement area that's pink in North Carolina. But the richest plantation zones with very large plantations, they tend to favor the Federalists. They want a more limited democracy, more elite control. But when you get into the southern counties where you have a larger number of the yeoman farmers, the small-scale farmers, they tend to be very Jeffersonian in their voting patterns. An emerging important factor here are newspapers. Each party has a number of newspapers associated with it. So for the Democratic Republicans, one of the most important was something called the American Aurora. I notice here is radically anti-Federalist. No surprise, edited by an Irish-American journalist, William James. If you can look at the placard on the upper left, it says, 200 years ago, a Philadelphia newspaper claimed George Washington wasn't the father of the country. It claimed that John Adams really wanted to be a king, and its editors were later arrested. We'll talk about that under the Alien and Sedition Act. But anyway, these newspapers were becoming more and more important. And I'll also note here the Federalists accused Duane of promoting interracial democracy and wanting to divide the country with French assistance. So this kind of vituperative insult slinging that we see so much in modern politics dates back to a very early period. As I noticed before, the Federalists tended to have more supports in cities. The United States was overwhelmingly rural. In 1796, the first the census of 1800 gave the U.S. population as a whole of 5.3 million and only 7% urban. And that meant at the time any settlement with over, I think it was 2,500 people was considered urban. It's a map I made a while back, and it shows the largest cities in the country at the time. It's done in little squares, each square representing 10,000 residents. So if you could see Philadelphia there, I think it's about 40,000 residents, about 30,000 in New York. Point of this, though, is that most of the smaller cities are in New England, particularly coastal areas. You could see a number of them here. And if we were to have gone down to 5,000 people or 2,000 people, we would have seen the same pattern, a real concentration of these smaller cities in New England, very trade oriented, a lot of shipping out of New England, already people going and getting into the China trade, really quite global at an early period of time. In the south of Baltimore, the only city that makes the map is Charleston. That's going to be true for a long period of time. Virginia really didn't have hardly anything in the way of cities. Yeah, it had some towns. Alexandria, for example, would be one. So there was definitely, a few towns, but nothing very big. And partly that was because of the self-sufficiency of the plantation economy. Although in the case of Charleston, you did get a pretty substantial city at an early period. Also to note is this early split between Federalists and Democratic Republicans, or supporters of Alexander Hamilton versus supporters of Jefferson and Madison, was exacerbated by foreign affairs. Already, as early as 1794, under Washington and Hamilton, quite a pro-British treaty was established, the Jay Treaty. You can see Treaty of Amity, Commerce, and Navigation between His Britannic Majesty and the United States. And this is something that really angered Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans and led to these charges that people like Hamilton and Adams wanted to move towards a monarchical form of government. Not much evidence for that, but this would be one, being a bit of information that would be used for this. Infuriated revolutionary France. So it's really important to note that in this entire period up till 1815, when Napoleon was finally defeated in Waterloo, and the end of the threat of Napoleon it can't come to an end, Europe was in political turmoil and war. That started with the French Revolution in 1789. Shortly after the French Revolution occurred, other European powers sent in their armies to topple it. The French did mass mobilization of a citizen army, which was very effective, and then Napoleon took over that system and conquered most of Europe. This map shows Europe under Napoleon in 1812, and you can see a French empire much larger than France, but all the countries in green are under the control of Napoleon, and even those in pink, the Austrian Empire, Prussia, Denmark, were all states that had been hostile to Napoleon. He defeated them and sort of forced them to become allies. And it was really only Britain, Russia, Sweden, Portugal to some extent that were withstanding Napoleon. And the United States was already a mercantile power, especially New England, but engaged in a lot of trade with the Caribbean, trade with West Africa. Early American merchants were involved in the slave trade and in ancillary trades connected to that. And like I said before, we're trading in East Asia as well. This European war, though, had global repercussions, and the United States sort of had to often try to avoid picking a side between France and Britain, the two main antagonists during this period. But especially in the earlier period, the Federalists really inclined more towards Britain, the Democratic Republicans towards France, that resulted in a lot of tension. And under the presidency of John Adams, this tension sort of reached a head, and one of the reasons was the passing of the Alien and Sedition Acts. So these are a number of acts passed under the you can see here 1798 under the administration of John Adams, the last 4 years of the 1700s. So the Alien Acts hardened citizenship requirements, made it much easier to deport non-citizens. The Sedition Act criminalized false and malicious statements about the federal government, very similar to a lot of our current concerns over misinformation and malinformation, if you will. Sedition Act was used to suppress publications like the Philadelphia Aurora, which I showed you earlier, that were favorable towards Jefferson and the Jeffersonians. So these were acts that the Democratic Republicans just despised, really saw them as authoritarian and against the spirit of the Constitution. Adams also rebuilt the military, raised taxes, something was not popular among the Jeffersonians. And again, these things are still very much in the news. Here's an article from, I just did a Google search of the the Alien Enemies Act of 1790. That's part of the Alien and Sedition Acts of the Adams administration. So the Libertarian magazine Reason had the most succinct headline. That's why I used it. Trump's plan to use the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 as a tool of mass deportation. So, literally going right back to this period and to some very controversial aspects of it. Jefferson and Madison were appalled. They responded with something known as the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. I should have resolutions with a plural there in the heading. It was passed by those two states' legislatures, written by Madison and Jefferson. And basically what they argued is that the states have a right and indeed a duty to reject what they consider to be unconstitutional acts, the Alien and Sedition Acts. They also believed really upheld states' rights and a strict interpretation of the Constitution. Now, I note this is ironic because at this time Madison and Jefferson were using these ideas against what they saw as the authoritarian tendencies of the Adams administration. Later on, states' rights and strict interpretation of the Constitution come to be associated with the conservative movement or the political right. We'll talk about that throughout this lecture course. But I think it's very important to bring it up because ideas that at one given time might be associated with what we might call the political right or political left can at other times and circumstances become associated with the other faction, if you will. Anyway, a rematch is in 1800. Jefferson had been vice president, always pretty much marginalized from the administration because he did not see eye to eye with President John Adams. They have a rematch in 1800, and you can see Jefferson is the victor, 73 versus 65 electoral votes. The popular vote is a bit more unequal, but remember, most states did not use the popular vote to pick their electors in the Electoral College. They used their state legislatures. But as far as the state map goes, very clear, all New England states here in favor of Adams the Federalist. Adams also got almost half the electors from Pennsylvania. You got New Jersey and Delaware, and a third of North Carolina. Jefferson actually claimed this as another revolution. He's famously said every generation needs a new revolution, and he thought his election in 1800 amounted to one because it meant to him a country turning away from the rather authoritarian rule of Adams, moving away from, rejecting Alien and Sedition Acts, wanting more democratization, which does indeed happen. Jefferson also was a very astute politician, wanted to conciliate his opposition. So he did not exclude Federalists from governmental seats. And as he famously said, we are all Federalists, we are all Republicans. In this election, only a few states had popular vote. Rhode Island, Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina were the only ones. All the rest used their state legislature. But we have returns. Most of the patterns are kind of easy to interpret. You can note the darkest brown, over 80% for John Adams. These are the most, in terms of this one county I'm pointing at, St. Mary's County, Maryland, had a very strong Roman Catholic majority. It was also maritime, mercantile orientation to a certain extent, but that Catholic majority was very strongly Federalist. But the more recent Catholic immigrants coming into cities like New York and Philadelphia, they tended to support Democratic Republicans, as we've seen. So a big difference. And later on, the Catholic vote is going to generally incline more in the Democratic direction. You can see that Cape Fear region of North Carolina with the Scottish Highlanders, who are given large land grants, tend to be very strongly pro-Federalist. There's an area in western Virginia, now would be West Virginia, a county with a very strong Federalist vote, very strong. The big differences here. I was not able to find the information to try to understand that, because this is sort of in a more frontier zone, and these frontier areas tend to be more egalitarian, tended to be much more Jeffersonian in their orientation. So I have to apologize for not being able to explain that. A little bit more about that Cape Fear region of North Carolina, settled by Scottish Highlanders. It's interesting, if you could look at the 1790 census, it'll tell you the number of enslaved people. And of those two arrows, one shows that Cape Fear region with very, very few. This was settled by Scottish Highlanders. It was not a plantation zone by any stretch of the imagination. Whereas you can see a big difference between the coastal part of South Carolina, further south, and then further north as well, extending a little bit into North Carolina, where we have much larger populations of people of African background. In 1900, the Democratic Republicans also make gains in the Senate and in the House, both of them. It's good reasons why Jefferson regarded this as a sort of a revolution of 1800. Because, note, I put in a colored box on the upper left, and you could see the seat change, with the Democratic Republicans gaining 22 seats and the Federalists losing 22. And that's a pretty small House at the time. And so, and the Senate Senate map as well. You can see you can see New York and Pennsylvania in addition to all southern states. You can see Democratic Republican gains. So the gains are in that dark green. The big problem, though, in this election of 1800 was the vice presidential election. Because the way it worked in the original Constitution was that each elector gets 2 votes. And a single elector then is supposed to basically pick the person they want to be president for one of their votes. And then they're going to vote for another one who they want to be vice president. Because they're starting to get running mates. You've got parties established now. And so Adams running as a Federalist, and Pinckney from South Carolina as his running mate. But you don't want all those Adams electors to give their second vote to Pinckney, because you don't want them to be tied. You want Adams to have more. And so one of those Adams electors voted for someone else for vice president, so Adams got one more. The problem was the Democratic Republicans flubbed it. You can see Jefferson got 73 electoral votes, so he beat Adams. He's going to become president. But Aaron Burr, his running mate, got exactly the same amount. There was supposed to be one elector who gave someone else one of his votes. But they didn't. They blew it. So as a result, this was a tied election. This was a contingent election. It had to be sent to the House of Representatives then to choose who becomes president. Because is it going to be Jefferson? He got 73. Or is it going to become Aaron Burr? He got 73 as well. So it goes to the House, but it doesn't go to the House that was elected in 1800. The House that was elected in 1800 has a substantial Jeffersonian or Democratic Republican majority, but it goes to the old House elected in 1798, and that has a Federalist majority. So the House has to decide. Each state votes as a unit, but so the House contingencies from each state, they have to hammer out, okay, who are we voting for? But anyway, it wasn't easy. 36 ballots were necessary. All the Democratic Republicans were in favor of Jefferson. He was the founder of the party. Most Federalists, though, supported Burr. Burr is quite a different character, often seen as a conniver, someone who really wanted the presidency, and that wasn't good at the time. And the president was not supposed to be wanting it. They were supposed to be somebody who was called to serve. But anyway, Jefferson is the leader of the Democratic Republicans. Is not something that most Federalists would want to have there. He's their main opponent. But it's actually Alexander Hamilton who swung the election by urging his supporters to go for Jefferson. So Hamilton regarded as Jefferson as his main sort of opponent, but at least he respected Jefferson, and he did not respect Aaron Burr at all. And so in the end, like I say, each state delegation votes, but in the end, It was only New England states, not even all of them, not Vermont, but who voted for Aaron Burr. And that began his process of embitterment that would be compounded when a few years later he sees Alexander Hamilton as working to deprive him of winning the governorship of New York. That led to the infamous duel where Aaron Burr killed Alexander Hamilton. But anyway, back to the main story. This was such a chaotic situation that people realized that the Constitution had to be amended. It just wasn't working. So the 12th Amendment, you still have each elector in the Electoral College having 2 votes, but one of those votes goes for president and one goes for vice president. So you don't have this sort of competition within the same party for president and vice president. So you can still have a contingent election. That's if nobody gets a majority of the Electoral College. And then it goes to the House again, and the House chooses one of the top 3 contenders. And for vice president, you have the same sort of thing, but that goes to the Senate. We'll see later on that there definitely was one election where that happened. Jefferson's popularity surged in 1803 when he arranged the Louisiana Purchase, purchasing a huge amount of land from France, from Napoleon, essentially. Effectively double the size of the United States. Now, at the time, it was almost entirely controlled by indigenous nations who would have to be defeated and conquered and dispossessed. But it was certainly a potential U.S. land, and it already had a pretty substantial city in it. This was very popular in the United States. The Federalists were suspicious. They were not certain what to think about westward expansion. They knew that the western frontier areas tended to be much less urban and more egalitarian and less disposed towards the Federalist cause. So the Federalists were a little suspicious of this. If we look at U.S. cities, same kind of map that I made a while back, but for 1910, you could see New Orleans is already one of the largest cities in the country. It was at the time of acquisition with about 20,000 people. You can see New York has surged ahead here. But the important thing to note is not just that New Orleans is a city, but it's at the mouth, near the mouth of the Mississippi River. And as the United States is expanding westward, that Mississippi River system, which I've highlighted, including the Ohio River, Illinois River, and others, that's the main conduit of trade and transportation. This is well before the railroad era. Roads were very, very poor. You wanted to move goods, and you did it by water if you could. And so for Western farmers, their way to get their goods to market was down the river and then to New Orleans, which is the main port here. So it gives the U.S. effective control over that very important river system. A few other things I want to note is Louisiana was a remnant of France's vast pre-1763 North American Empire. In 1763 was the end of the 7 Years' War, or what is often called the French and Indian War in the United States, where Britain defeated France yet again and essentially took their North American territory, all that area in blue claimed by France. France arranged so that the areas west of the Mississippi went to Spain instead of Britain, and then when Napoleon took control of Spain, France got it back. That's how Napoleon was able to sell it to the United States. So it's mostly controlled by indigenous languages, but there were small and important French settlements. Well, a pretty substantial one in New Orleans, a few tens of thousands of people. But even the area around St. Louis and a few other areas in the central Mississippi Valley, there were definitely French settlements, a few thousands of people. And up to this day, there's a pretty sizable area in southern Louisiana where the main native language is Creole French, or Cajun, what the people are generally called. It's interesting, 2002 is estimated about 77,000 people in southern Louisiana learned Creole French as their first language. But in 1960, it was 1 million. I mean, this is a big population. And supposedly there are even perhaps a few older people in eastern Missouri who still speak what was called Pawpaw French. Of course, they're all bilingual in English, but it's interesting, according to the Wikipedia, fewer than a dozen in 2015, so it's probably gone. But it is, I think, pretty intriguing that there were these French settlements that then were incorporated into the United States. So that Louisiana Purchase made Jefferson extremely popular. And in 1804, the Democratic Republicans just score a huge victory. You could see 162 electoral votes to Rufus Charles Pinckney of South Carolina and his running mate Rufus King getting only 14. And the popular vote, which is admittedly only in a few states, it's even more imbalance. In the House of Representatives, you could see the Democratic Republicans won 114. The Federalists only 28, and it's only if you look at the Electoral College, only Connecticut and Delaware went for Pinckney in the Electoral College. Jefferson, though, falters a few years later on what's known as the Embargo Act, and again, this is the issue with Britain and France at war, and both countries are basically preying on American shipping. What Britain would do is stop American ships and look for seamen to impress into its own navy. And they'd say, well, these were people who were British citizens who've recently fled to the United States, and they have no right to do so. We're engaged in this war to the death with Napoleonic France, and we need every mariner we can get. That infuriated the United States. French privateers, which are basically pirates with permission to prey on others, were seizing American ships as well. The American merchants were trying to trade equally with both, but Napoleon, neither side wanted people trading with the other. And so this was putting huge pressure, and Jefferson decided, well, let's just have an embargo on both of them. And basically, this prevented American ships from sailing to most foreign ports, at least European ports. And it was designed to put a lot of pressure on Britain and to some extent on France. You could see, though, from the cartoon of the time that it caused huge problems with American merchants, particularly those in New England, who are the ones who dominate trade. So anyway, it was hugely controversial. It caused major economic disruption, particularly in New England and other parts of the Northeast in the trade-oriented cities. It required extensive federal intervention to enforce it. And this is actually against sort of Democratic Republican principles. Remember, the Democratic Republicans were the party of relatively less federal intervention, and this Embargo Act required a lot. But there's also an interesting irony on the other side, because it really helped nurture infant industries in New England. This is what the Federalists wanted, right? They wanted a big tariff so that those developing textile mills and ironworks and others are going to be able to compete against the British. Well, if you can't trade with the British, obviously that means that it's going to be Americans who are going to have to make those products, and so it was very beneficial, not to the merchants who were the most powerful, but to this sort of rising group of manufacturers in New England who are not politically dominant, but later will become so, and it's actually helpful for them. So the Embargo Act was not popular in New England, but some New Englanders supported it. John Quincy Adams, son of President John Adams, an extraordinarily accomplished man who had been raised partly in Europe on diplomatic missions, becomes an incredibly important diplomat himself, and I'll talk a lot about John Quincy Adams in the next lecture. But anyway, he supported the Embargo Act. He was a firm patriot. He very much supported the Louisiana Purchase and Western expansion, and other Federalists were not too keen on that, and so he leaves the party of his father, and joins the Jeffersonians. He thought the Federalists were too pro-British and basically not nationalistic enough. That's what he was. So anyway, in 1808, the Democratic Republicans score another presidential landslide. You can see 100, not quite as landslidey as the previous one, but now it's James Madison, another one of the founders. Also of Virginia, Charles Pinckney of South Carolina, still in there, competing again. But Madison gets 122 to Pinckney's 47, and you can see a big difference in the popular vote as well. Similar pattern, though. Now the Federalists have retaken most of New England, all except Vermont. Federalists still have Delaware and a couple of electoral votes in North Carolina, but it's really a geographical split, with the Mid-Atlantic basically siding with the South against New England. Even though Madison does win, the Federalists make some pretty big gains in the House. So you can see the Democratic Republicans losing 22 seats, the Federalists gaining 22. The Democratic Republicans still have almost twice as many seats, but it is a shift in the Federalist direction because of the Embargo Act. And you can see the Federalists gained a lot of seats, not just in New England, but also in the Mid-Atlantic states. They gained seats in North Carolina, even some in the frontier area of the western part of Virginia. Another interesting thing on this map, and I'll return to this in a second, though, is a dissident Republican gain. You can see dissident Republican hold and gain. You can see the relatively new state of Ohio there in that category. So the dissident Republicans were people who had been part of this Jeffersonian faction, but thought that Jefferson and, in this case now, Madison, were betraying the limited government principles, that they were they didn't like the direction they were going, and like I say, they become even more prominent a little bit later. But these are dissident Democratic Republicans. They wanted to adhere more closely to the original Jeffersonian vision of limited government, limited federal government in particular. Madison's second election was a very troubled one because it's 1812. And now, by this time, the U.S. and the United Kingdom are at war in the eponymous War of 1812, as it's called, certainly in the United States. So anger at the British was mounting. A lot of this, again, had to do with impressing American citizens, sailors at sea, forcing them to fight on British ships. Britain's view was they're engaged in this sort of struggle of survival with Napoleon, and they needed to do whatever they could. But it was set off in the United States also by what was happening in the Northwest, the old Northwest territories. And this was at a time when American settlers were streaming into the region. Ohio had become a state, as you noticed in the previous map. Settlers are moving into Indiana. The indigenous people were not happy. They were, of course, divided into separate tribes or indigenous nations, but they had, by this time, pretty much united under the leadership of two Shawnee leaders, particularly the military leader Tecumseh. And so it's called Tecumseh's War here. So there was very interesting. If you look at the map there on the left, you can see right in the middle of the green territory, Tecumseh's territory, Prophetstown. So the prophet was his brother. I'm not going to try to pronounce his name here. It's written in the bottom left there. But Tecumseh's brother basically saw himself sort of as a prophet for sort of a new religious movement, if you will, to unite the indigenous people against the onslaught of European settlers. So by uniting these different groups, that gave them a tremendous amount of power. And as I think I said earlier, there were still British forts in the region. The British were supposed to dismantle, never did. That led to a lot of anger in the United States about that. And there was a lot of concern that the British were actually supporting Tecumseh's Indigenous Federation, and infuriated a lot of Americans, particularly those settlers in the West. So there was a U.S. war against Tecumseh. You can see here the Battle of Tippecanoe. We will revisit that later on because it's the American commander in that battle, William Henry Harrison, would become president under the Whig Party in 1840. But Tecumseh was defeated. I think he died 2 years later in another battle. So this war was popular in the West, defeating this powerful indigenous confederacy. It was quite popular in the South. It was very unpopular in the Northeast. However, where merchants were favorably disposed toward the British, traded with the British a lot. So it was deeply popular there. The Warhawks, those who really wanted to pursue it, wanted to kick the British out of North America. They wanted to take over Canada. There were several invasions of Canada by the United States. They did not succeed. The British responded by sending in a military force, which took over Washington, D.C. and burned the White House, as you can see here. In this election of this year, when this war is going on, even a lot of the Democratic Republicans split from Madison, particularly those in New York. And it's important to understand, too, how these parties were national parties, but they were built on state parties. And so the state party of the Democratic Republicans in New York, which is a state that, New York is the biggest city in the country by this time. It's got a lot of trade. So the New York political establishment did not want to pursue the war. They joined with the Federalists. They still lost, though, but you can see it's much closer. It's the last hurrah of the Federalists in league with the New York branch of the Democratic Republicans. But you could see James Madison still pretty handily won re-election in the Electoral College. New York and New Jersey, Delaware, along with all New England states except Vermont, with the Federalist cause, but the Democratic Republicans obviously win. In the House of Representatives, the Federalists gained 32 seats. The Republicans gained 7. The House is expanding with new states coming in. Notice on the map, Louisiana, a state now, separate from the others. But you can see the certain areas of the North, the Democratic Republicans win. Most of Pennsylvania, and a few inland areas, but for the most part, it's still a green map here for the Federalists. A green map here, I'm sorry, for the Democratic Republicans. But the Federalists were so upset that in 1814 they called a convention in Hartford, Connecticut, the Hartford Convention, New England Federalists, basically demanding significant changes to the U.S. Constitution. Demanding they get rid of the 3/5 compromise. So that's a compromise, whereas enslaved people in the South are counted in terms of representation in the House of Representatives and hence in the Electoral College. Each enslaved person counts as 3/5 of a person. So a lot of the Federalists here said, this gives the South an unfair advantage. You have these people who are, they're chattel slaves. They're not at all enfranchised. They're not part of the political community by any stretch of the imagination, yet they count as far as the seats go. And they said if we get rid of that, and if only if enslaved people are not counted, then the South is going to have many fewer votes in the House of Representatives and in the Electoral College. But they also called for a 2/3 congressional vote. You need a big majority if we're going to have new states. Remember, they're suspicious of new states. New states tend to be Democratic, Republican, but they want 2/3 congressional vote for war or trade restrictions. Most important is they were really talking about seceding from the Union. And this is really what undoes the Federalists, because shortly thereafter the war ends. It's in 1814. It's an arranged treaty. It's basically a draw, the treaty that's arranged in what is now Belgium, Treaty of Ghent. But in the United States, the war is framed as a U.S. success, even though it wasn't. It was, like I say, pretty much a draw. But the last battle of the war, it actually occurred, I think, 12 days after the treaty was signed, but news hadn't reached yet. But the British were trying to take over this extraordinarily important port of New Orleans, mouth of the Mississippi. Andrew Jackson, U.S. military leader, later becomes president, defeats them, and so it's a very decisive American victory. So the Democratic Republicans can kind of claim, well, victory at New Orleans, we didn't lose to the greatest power in the world. And then they turn on the Federalists as people who are not patriotic, who are ready to secede from the Union, who are traitors, if you will. And so that pretty much is the beginning of the end of the Federalist Party. Meanwhile, I think I have 6 more slides here, but so I'm close to the end. Meanwhile, though, as the Federalists are collapsing, more and more Federalists are leaving the party and joining the Democratic Republicans, and the Democratic Republicans are increasingly adopting a lot of what had been Federalist ideas. Not all of them by any means. They certainly wanted westward expansion, which the Federalists were not too keen on. But the Federalists always wanted federal investment in infrastructure. And the Democratic Republicans had previously said, well, that's up for the states. That's not a federal issue. Look at the Constitution. Where do you see it? But the Westerners tended to be Democratic Republicans, but their states were too poor. A new state like Ohio, it didn't have the wherewithal. So they wanted the federal government to do it. And in 1811 already, under the Democratic Republicans, Congress agreed to build a national road. There weren't many roads. The roads were not very good in those days, but a road across the Appalachian Mountains to go into Ohio and then Indiana and Illinois. Ultimately, they wanted it to extend further, but there were always political battles over that. So this is just a good example of the federal government getting involved in these infrastructural projects. It is important to note, though, that the states were still much more important. The big infrastructural project of this time was the Erie Canal, connecting the Hudson River to Lake Erie. Lake Erie is not well connected to Ontario because you have Niagara Falls between them. But Lake Erie is very close to a number of rivers in the Ohio River system. You could pretty easily get from one to the other. And so through the Erie Canal, you can go up the Hudson River from New York City, get to the canal, get to Lake Erie, and from there you can get into Lake Michigan. You're basically into the interior system of water navigation by lakes and rivers. And this is really what cemented New York City's position as the main city in the country, because it's the entree into the interior. And this was all done by New York State. It begins in 1817, completed in 1825, so really important. And if we could just see, jumping ahead, this is the map of 1840. This just has all U.S. cities that had over 10,000 residents at the time. The lighter red color are cities that would be covered up by the large rectangle of an even larger city. So you can see New York and Boston. There's several smaller cities nearby, but that was the only way I could figure out how to map it. But all those cities are either on the ocean, the seacoast, or a bay, in the case of places like Baltimore, or on a major navigable river, or on the Erie Canal. You can see there's a whole series of them. Even now, and you've got a few smaller cities in Virginia. They're all on navigable rivers, actually right near what is called the fall line, where you go from the Atlantic coastal plain into the Piedmont. There's rapids or waterfalls. That's the head of navigation, easy navigation. So that's where cities tended to be built. As I was saying, the Democratic Republicans are adopting what had been Federalist ideas. Another one was a national bank. Hamilton, that was key to his project, and when Jefferson comes into power, the national bank that Hamilton had founded is discontinued. But under Madison, it's recreated. So the idea is the United States, as a united country, a federal entity, needs to have its own bank that can regulate the credit that's being issued by private banks, that could establish a sound and stable currency. Madison had opposed the first bank as unconstitutional, but when he becomes president, he comes to see that it's can be very worthwhile, and so it's recreated. And that's going to be a huge issue of contention when Andrew Jackson comes in, who has the original Democratic Republican idea that this is unconstitutional. This is not a place for the federal government. And even Democratic Republicans even embraced and passed a Protectionist Tariff Act in 1816. So note that's 1 year after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and in 1815. So suddenly Europe is at peace. That means a flourishing of trade, but it also means British manufacturing is now flooding into the United States, and those new industries being created in New England are really suffering from cheaper British goods. Britain is the most technologically advanced country at the time, and the U.S. manufacturers sort of are behind the curve, and so they wanted this protective tariff. It's the only tariff ever passed with substantial Southern support. That's going to become a huge bone of contention between the Democratic Party, which Andrew Jackson founds out of the wreckage of the Democratic Republican Party, and a new party called the Whig Party, which is kind of a continuation of some of the Federalist ideas, but they're going to be fighting over tariff. And then after the Civil War, the Democrats and Republicans are going to be fighting over tariff all the way up into the 20th century. Okay, we only have a few more points to make here in this lecture. But I do want to mention again the old Republicans. I had dissident Republicans before, but they're pretty much the same group. So these were people who really wanted to stay loyal to the original Jeffersonian ideas. They despised the fact that the Democratic Republican Party was adapting Federalist ideas in terms of a stronger central for federal government and federal investments and infrastructure and tariff and all of this. And the leader of these old Republicans was a very interesting man, John Randolph of Roanoke, because he's always mentioned. Came from a very highly educated, illustrious plantation family from Virginia. But he broke with Jefferson and Madison, formed a separate group, the Tertium Quid, or the Third Party, if you will, believed in strict adherence to the Constitution. I'll read a quote from him. He summarized what he called the old Republican principles: love of peace, hatred of offensive war, jealousy of state governments towards the general or federal government, dread of standing armies, a loathing of public debts, of taxes, of excises, I'd add of tariffs, tenderness for the liberties of the citizen, argus-eyed jealousy of the patronage of the president. So really wanted limited government, particularly limited federal government. John Randolph had some intellectual influence, but he was too unyielding, sort of too extreme to have much influence, although Andrew Jackson would later adopt many of his ideas. Important to note, though, firm believer in freedom, but that's freedom within a sort of Southern plantation aristocratic family. So he was very conservative in many ways. I mean, he even believed in things like primogeniture and entail. Entail was the British European policy that landed estates could not be broken up and sold. They had to go to the first son or whoever the next heir was. They had to be passed down through families to maintain a rural aristocracy. And Randolph was very much a proponent of that. So he was a believer in this, the freedom of the aristocrats is one way maybe of looking at it. Another really interesting thing about him, and this is sort of an aside, but he's believed to suffered a genetic anomaly, the XXY, 2 X chromosomes and 1 Y. Which meant that he never became sexually mature, voice never broke, never developed facial hair. Didn't seem to have hurt him, though, in the politics of the time, which is interesting. So, yes, brilliant and bellicose, an interesting figure of the time who wanted to stop the clock and go back to the ideals of some of the early Republican thinkers. Second to last slide, I want to note by 1860, the Federalists are essentially finished. The South is now overwhelmingly Democratic Republican, even South Carolina. Just a few areas where the Federalists still had still getting votes at this time. Uh, this is beginning a new epoch in American history that's strongly Democratic. Now, remember that Democratic, that means white male Democratic, certainly does not mean women, it does not mean blacks, it does not mean indigenous people. But as far as white male population goes, an era that's becoming increasingly democratic and anti-elitist that's associated with the growing of the West. And I will talk about that in the second half of this lecture. But I will just end here in 1816 when James Monroe, the last of the founders, favored candidate of Jefferson and Madison. Federalists are still putting up a candidate, Rufus King, who really makes the first sort of strong anti-slavery stance in an election. It does him little good. You could see the Monroe won every state except Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Delaware. So I'll pick up the lecture again, second half, by talking about the election of 1820, where Monroe wins again, and he wins unopposed. The Federalists are essentially gone as a national party by that time. They still have some members of Congress, but it's finished. And that's what is sometimes known as the era of good feelings. And then in 1824, the Democratic Republican Party itself is going to splinter into a number of different candidates. But in the second half of this lecture, which will be quite a bit shorter, I'll also talk about sort of some of the more general issues of what's going on in this period. So thank you for listening, and I hope you tune into the next segment. Bye-bye.